Hello and welcome to this special broadcast. I'm Nayantara Rai. After almost a year of consultations and discussions, the Narendra Modi government has finally released the draft of its National Telecom Policy for public comments. The broad contours of this policy focus on high-speed broadband, access to broadband to every citizen by the year of 2022, and a target of attracting investments of $100 billion again by 2022. It talks of creating 40 lakh new jobs. Artificial intelligence is mentioned, as is net neutrality. So before I go any further, let me go across to my colleague Tushar Chakravarti, who will bring you a short synopsis of what all has made its way into the draft National Telecom Policy. Hi Tushar.
The government yesterday unveiled the National Telecom Policy, and as far as the broad contours of the same is concerned, the policy primarily focuses on universal provision of broadband to all, 5G rollout, attracting $100 billion investment in the telecom space, creating 4 million additional jobs, and increasing the share of digital communication in GDP to 8%, and it seeks to sort of achieve all these targets by 2022. Apart from that, as far as spectrum is concerned, in the finer details, the telecom policy also talks about reviewing of the various levies that are imposed currently on the telecom service providers and telecom companies. It has said that a review of the spectrum usage charge, the license fee, as well as the USOF fund levy is in order, which also has been a long-standing demand of telecom companies. Apart from that, there has been a regulatory change which has also been brought out in the telecom policy, and which also has gotten the nod of the Telecom Commission yesterday, which is the setting up of a telecom ombudsman for looking into consumer grievances. As far as the entire setup and framework of the same is concerned, the sector regulator TRAI will be responsible for it, and it will require a change in the TRAI Act itself. Importantly, in the background of a debate on data privacy and security on a global level, the NTP also focuses on digital sovereignty and security, and it goes on to say that existing license agreements can be sort of modified to ensure that data protection and privacy norms are sort of put in place to ensure that Indians are protected from any sort of data theft. So quite a comprehensive and exhaustive list of proposals as far as this new telecom policy is concerned.
Right, thanks Tushar for that. You know, it's a lengthy document. We're just trying to bring you a short synopsis of it. Let me now invite my guest on the show. Joining us initially is Rajan Mathews, the Director General of COAI. I'm also being joined by industry expert Sanjay Kapoor. Good evening, gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us here on ET Now. Rajan Mathews, I'm going to come to you first. We are in 2018. We are still dreaming of every Indian citizen having access to broadband. A speed of 50 Mbps is what this draft policy is envisaging, saying this should be possible by 2022, at a time when other countries are talking about artificial intelligence and God knows what all. But I want to first begin by asking you that do you think the targets that have been enlisted, for example, broadband access, 10 gigabytes to every gram panchayat in India by 2022, are these realistic targets?
So first of all, let me say, I think from my perspective, it's a very good document. It process-wise got the inputs of all of the key stakeholders, and you've got these three big ideas in terms of mission statement, in terms of connect and propel and secure. And I think those are the appropriate major headline amounts. Of course, then you get into the lower level order in terms of implementation, and you ask how we're going to get these accomplished. And I think the first and foremost recognition in the NTP document, which I'm very grateful for, is the recognition that all of these are really depending on the robustness of your digital network and the digital infrastructure that is going to make all of this happen. So I think that is the key point to be had. And if the digital infrastructure and the network is not going to be on par and going to be able to deliver these things, then the types of issues you pointed out, whether it's 10 Gbps or to the minimum speeds at 100 Mbps speeds. Those would be a real challenge. So I think the first order of magnitude is ensuring financial viability, financial health, get the investments, make your networks up to snuff and ready for all of these things that you want to happen on this digital platform.
Okay, so you're giving a thumbs up to this document as of now, but Sanjay Kapoor, and I'm going to bring Rajan Mathews in this, and I know he'll have very strong views. I'm bringing you in as a more neutral voice at the moment. If you're going to do all of this and you're going to see 5G as a reality, you're going to need telecom companies to invest. The government's hoping to attract $100 billion. Where's that money going to come from? At least the Indian companies, besides RailJio, keep talking about being cash-strapped, about having overburdened balance sheets.
So, Nayantara, let's be very focused in this discussion and say that I think everybody's on the same page with the fact that the virtual infrastructure and its competitiveness also drives the competitiveness of India as a nation. I think everybody accepts that, and therefore this document is looking as comprehensive as it is looking today. And I'm glad that it has covered all facets that are possible to make a robust industry and a sustainable industry going forward. And the world is watching us on how do we execute this, because the real detail will come out of how we spell out and execute these, and the execution is going to determine how we are going to be competitive versus rest of the world. I think monies will follow based on how we perform on these, and I'm glad that the government is looking at the competitiveness of the industry to begin with, and therefore relook at our AGR definition, relook at our taxation, relook at our SUC charges, the obligation funds, etc., etc. And I think that will drive a bit of competitiveness. The second most important thing is how spectrum gets priced in this country, and government's willing to relook at how the base price of the spectrum will get redefined, and that will determine whether going forward an industry which requires tons and tons of spectrum to roll out great customer experience and be internationally competitive, whether that raw material is priced rightly or not. And I'm glad that government is willing to open up that topic as well. My take on this is that in India we get too enamored by the numbers, and we start ticking the boxes to say, have we reached so many villages, have we reached so much population, etc., etc. And I think the quality gets compromised somewhere. I think one of the things, despite of large numbers that we claim in India, is pathetic customer experience over the last few years, where you do not get signals indoor. The entire transformation from voice to data has moved traffic from outdoors to indoors, but our networks do not perform indoors. Whereas if you see any statistics, we sound as if we are larger than life. I think the focus in the new telecom policy as we execute must also be on the quality and the customer experience. Otherwise, our competitiveness as a nation is still going to suffer despite of large numbers that we claim to the rest of the world. I think that is going to be absolutely paramount going forward. The real acid test on any data services, at least for the next 4-5 years, is going to be, do we have video-ready networks, and do we have
I'm not sure they're going to stop looking at the numbers, Sanjay Kapoor. This is also a government which is now saying it has electrified all of India. I don't think this government is going to stop looking at numbers. It is taking the claim of having electrified all of India at the moment. I'm sure it will want to come through with similar numbers and make similar claims as far as the telecom sector goes as well. I'm being also joined now by the former telecom secretary, who was also the former president of NASSCOM, Mr. R. Chandrasekhar. Thanks so much for joining us here on ET Now. What did you make of this vision document of National Telecom Policy 2018? A lot of goals that have been set out for the telecom sector, the communication sector. And I began this conversation by asking Rajan Mathews, we're still talking about every citizen getting access to broadband when the developed world is talking about driverless cars and artificial intelligence, etc.
Well, good evening to everybody. First of all, I think as both Rajan and Sanjay have said, I think directionally this policy is saying all the right things. It cannot be faulted in terms of its approach. It has been preceded by some consultation. The three prongs of the approach, which is to connect, to ensure that everyone gets connected, to propel, which is to ensure that the new technology and 5G are enabled, and ensuring that this is done with security. All of these are right. The emphasis on investment is also, entirely appropriate, because clearly we need a lot of investment to get, this infrastructure going. And there are a lot of other plus points, whether you take the Jan Wi-Fi or the Nagar Net, the Gram Net, and so on. The emphasis on jobs and skilling, the reiteration of the commitment to net neutrality. There is a long list, but I think all the right buttons have been pressed. Where I think I would say that perhaps there could still be room for some concerns is really what is the roadmap by which all of these are going to be accomplished. Because at the end of the day, if you need the investment to come in, you need a good policy where clearly this is a good policy, but you also need a fairly viable sector. And if the viability is in question, and the recent numbers perhaps do raise some question marks, then the investment will not be smooth and massive. Now the question is that, clearly, it is not the job of the government to, intervene in making the industry viable, particularly when there is a disruption underway, where newer entrants with newer technology are disrupting older players, incumbents with legacy systems and legacy technology. So there is a limit to the extent to which the government can intervene in that respect. But and there are some very positive statements made with regard to optimal pricing of spectrum rather than maximal pricing of spectrum. I think that one word makes a world of difference, because it shows that as policy has been swinging from abstracting the maximum value for spectrum upfront to abstracting only revenue share to having some combination of the two, I think the realization that overemphasis on getting the maximum upfront payments for spectrum is actually having a serious adverse impact on investment and rollout of badly needed infrastructure. We are not a country where the infrastructure is already, well set. So, the roadmap for doing this, if you are not going to auction it to the highest bidder, at the same time there has to be a transparent process. Obviously, from a governance perspective, it has to be a transparent process. How will that happen? Enabling newer technology. Whether it is in terms of the spectrum allocation, the quantum of spectrum available, what is the roadmap, and how experimentation will be encouraged. It has been said, for example, that allocation of spectrum will be simplified, especially for some of the newer technologies, and made faster. I think that for all of this to have the required degree of credibility, a roadmap to that would be helpful. It doesn't necessarily have to be made a part of the policy, but for example, the statement that, okay, if you need a certain kind of spectrum or spectrum in a certain band for experimental use, non-commercial use, then it will be made available in a short period. You can't have a 9-month process for that kind of a thing. So all of these, I think the specifics are absolutely important. And
yeah, let me bring in TV Ramachandran here. Mr. Chandrasekhar, bear with me. I'm going to now bring in Mr. TV Ramachandran here. a lot of points being raised by the former Telecom Secretary, former NASSCOM President over there. What I found interesting was that he's seeing a transformational change when it comes to the government's perspective of looking at monetization of spectrum. Instead of maximizing it, you look at optimizing it. Sounds good on paper. Do you think the government will follow through with it? If you do have, the Supreme Court calls for auctions, so do you think this just means rationalization of levies?
Actually, I would like to say that the earlier speakers have highlighted some very good points, but the first perspective which I would like to place is that this is a great policy which has been placed up for consultation. I think it can be a game changer because the beginning itself is good in the sense that the perspective is one not of telecom policy but of digital communications. We have to rise to that level now in India. The conventional stages of thinking of circuit switch telecom policy, that era is over. We are now into the digital era. So this is a policy rightly perspective with broadband for all as its driver, and it has got certain very unique features which I have not seen in earlier policies. And I have been intimately involved in the earlier policies. For example, 1999 policy was completely, I was in working of that. So I know the differences. The first great thing about this policy, it has evolved in a most consultative way. We have never seen such exhaustive consultations with all stakeholders and at least a dozen committees set up in DOT for handling various specialist subjects. I think that's a very good process of getting a consultative input and coming out with this new draft policy. And the first and foremost is the fact that it can be a great thing for attracting investments if the two biggest things there which I see are action. They are right, my earlier speakers, that the actual thing is going to be in how these are translated into government orders and put into implementation. But how do you get better business economics to attract 100 billion fund investments? Simple things, two simple things are there which, if action, will do that. First is the fact that they said that telecom levies will be rationalized. That we have heard many times before. But what is there unique in this policy is telecom license fees and levies will be rationalized with input line credit. Those three words mean a lot. That means you can get a setback you get a sort of value-added benefit there, value-added tax benefit, which is what the sector has been wanting. And this will change the viability in terms of these levies, as well as spectrum usage charge, which is at a horrendously high level today of 5%. It says it will be to cover the cost of administration and regulation. And the cost of administration and regulation, as per data transparently available on the DOT website, will come to about 0.1%. So that can be a big, big benefit for the running of the sector.
Rajan Mathews.
Then, next important thing.
Rajan Mathews, I know you have very strong views on this point that Mr. Ramachandran is right now raising on execution and pricing. You have been the industry, if I may say so, voice on the government reducing all of its various charges so that the communication sector stays affordable. So while the government says it's willing to review all of these various levies to make 5G a reality, to make sure broadband is with every citizen, that you have 10 gigabytes per second of connectivity in every gram panchayat, $100 billion of investments comes in. What does the government need to do to help out the sector, to make sure that money does indeed trickle in, that India does not miss the bus like it did with 2G, 3G and 4G?
So very clearly, I think the specific points have been mentioned when we talk about enhancing the financial viability of companies. We said, listen, the spectrum usage charge needs to be brought down from an average of what is presently perhaps 5% to 1%. The license fee, which is at 8%, needs to come down to 3%, and then to a gliding scale perhaps to 1% as well over a 2 or 3 year period. We said the GST, which is at 18%, needs to be rationalized at at a more affordable 5%, which is congruent with its status as an essential service. We've talked about the pricing of spectrum, and again, I think speakers have talked about the quote-unquote optimization of that, and I think that's clear, because when you're going into 5G, an individual operator will need 100 megahertz of spectrum per operator. Today we have 30 and 40 paying tremendous amounts of money, and when we want to achieve these new goals, clearly there's got to be a optimization, whatever that term is, to look at spectrum, because that is a fundamental building block. And if we are to attract $100 billion of investment, and by the way, I think that's a conservative number, by the way. So if we are going to do that, no domestic bank presently is willing to lend, so we're looking at foreign sources predominantly. If we are going to attract that, sovereign health, economic health is important, and industry economic health is important. So unless those two are focused on, I don't think some of the other objectives will become reachable.
So Mr. Chandrasekhar, would you agree with Mr. Mathew over there that, yeah, good intentions, but maybe the goals are over ambitious? There's not enough meat in this document to show how any of this is going to be achieved. We don't know where the spectrum is going to come from. We don't know where this money is going to come from.
Well, I don't think that the goals are over ambitious at all, and I'm not sure that that's what Rajan was trying to say either. I think the question was that kind of money itself is not just required, but it's probably an underestimate. So the real question is, how do you ensure that not just $100 billion, but even more money flows into the sector? The first and foremost thing is that the policy needs to be conducive, which this policy is, and it's pressing, as I said, all the right buttons. But if the viability of that investment is not seen as being strong, by the investors, then that kind of investment will not come in. And I think that is the real question. How do you restore confidence of investors? So while this policy very clearly and positively affirms that the government is on the path of modernization, the path of enabling 5G and all of that, and of using it for different uses, it's been brought out very clearly that we have to go beyond just voice and video and start using it for different kinds of
we have to go on data.
Uses. So all of that, I think,
we have to go on data. So Sanjay Kapoor, that's a very interesting point. We have to go beyond voice, data, etc. So when you look at 5G, and India has said that it wants to be ahead of the curve when it comes to 5G, what do you make of this vision document? Any insight into how it is that we're going to roll out 5G? And keep your answer short, please. We're going to give the final comment to Mr. TVR after that.
Yeah, absolutely. You see, 5G is a very different animal. In India, even the viability on 4G is questioned, and the spectrum bands for 5G are all above 3 gigs of spectrum, which means that you will probably require electronics or towers at every 30 meters, 40 meters distance. And given the current economics of the industry, I don't know who will have the muscle to put in 1 million towers, 1.5 million towers to make 5G viable, unless and until we think innovatively and the policy drives a common infrastructure for the whole industry, and then people share that infrastructure and actually differentiate through their rollout, through their brands, policies, etc. in the marketplace. I think that's the only way 5G can be a reality. Given the current economics and the prevailing prices in the market, I don't know how will the investment of 5G get justified, even if the price of spectrum was to fall drastically. That's my intake.
On this. Clearly,
though 5G
maybe the
is going to be a reality, and sooner than later.
The government needs to pad this up. Yeah, I think the government needs to pad up with how this is going to be done and what 5G really is as well. Mr. Ramachandran, I'm going to give the final comments to you, and I'm not going to talk about all of this. What I want to get your view on is net neutrality, as well as the ombudsman that this vision document talks about. About time?
Yeah, see, the fact is the ombudsman is is a feature which was needed, a facility which was needed for the consumers. Sanjay had earlier said also about very poor consumer experience which is not being addressed, and that is what this ombudsman is coming in for, so that people can get, today nobody has the time to go run around the consumer courts, and this, a telecom ombudsman would be a help to give consumers some good attention that they deserve. But above all that, I think some of the key points have to be highlighted in this unique policy, in the sense that, like I said, the key is going to be the right levies, the right spectrum usage charge which is provided for, and most important, the optimal spectrum pricing, and that can happen only through an optimized auction design, because we're all for auctions. And auction design, optimal auction design has to follow to make the spectrum pricing happen, and that would happen through a TRA consultations. I don't know why we are all skeptical about these things. And the other great things in this policy are, I see the requirement to make 5 million Wi-Fi hotspots. We are all for Wi-Fi, we want broadband, we want database services, we want downloading. How will you do it without Wi-Fi? You know, in India, we have only 31,500 hotspots, public Wi-Fi hotspots. The world norm, if you go by the world norm of 1 per 150 persons, we should be having 8 million as of today. And the government is addressing that. I think that's a great thing we should go for, the way they are pushing the Wi-Fi requirement to meet the communication needs. Because more and more the spectrum is going to be, we are talking of 100 megahertz. Why? For 5G you require 1 gigahertz per operator also, depending on the higher frequencies. So that also will all need to be addressed. And the key thing about this policy, it's a great policy, but it has to be followed with several government orders to implement, because policy will remain a policy unless it is implemented, and implementation can only be through clear-cut government directives. Like, for example, even in satellite communication, which has been totally untouched for India.
Yet.
Satellite
this is a draft policy. This is a draft policy. It's thrown open to the public, and I'm sure all 4 of my panelists will be in touch with the government, will be giving very detailed comments to make sure that this vision document just doesn't stay as a vision, but becomes a reality. I think it's quite unanimous. The intent is there, the right intent is there. We need to have the execution and the way to execute it. I'm totally out of time, so I'd like to thank my 4 panelists for taking the time out and joining us here this evening for this special broadcast. Get down to sending those public comments so that we have the 8 million Wi-Fi hotspots that is needed by the country. Many thanks for watching.